Are you new to gardening and growing your own food? Do you want to transition your landscape to incorporate more native and beneficial plants for wildlife and pollinators? If so, great. I'm glad you're here because in this video, I will be touching on 3 areas of focus or 3 priorities for the beginner gardener. And within each of these categories, I'll be sharing lots of tips and insights from my own experience, as well as encouragements for you. If you're new around here, my name is Alexis. Welcome to Curating Simple. This is where I share on all kinds of things related to holistic health, motherhood, and simple living. Let's get into it with insight or priority number 1, and this is the learning curve. When you are new to gardening, it's really easy to be intimidated by all the content you see online or even other people's gardens that you drive by or walk past, and thinking, wow, they're so perfectly set up. They're very well established. They're lush and growing and so productive. And I could never do that. Or I don't have the resources or the finances to do that. I don't have the skill or the knowledge or the experience to do that. So my encouragement for you with this first priority or insight is to just get started. Every gardener begins somewhere. I'm sure you've heard the saying that goes, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the next best time is today. That is absolutely true when it comes to gardening. You don't have to have all the resources or the tools or the finances you think everyone else has to get started gardening. I encourage you to look around you, utilize the tools and the resources that you do have, utilize the space and the sunlight that you do have, and get started growing. And even if you really are in a season where you don't have access to a growing space, maybe you're in an apartment with a north-facing balcony and you just have shade to work with, you can still utilize this time and this season to learn. You can commit yourself to learning about all things gardening. If this is something you're passionate about, there's no wasted time here. And you can do this by reading books, by watching videos. You can be connecting with various resources in your community. You can maybe even shift gears and work at a nursery or a co-op and really start becoming more intimately connected with plants and growing and learning the vocabulary and learning techniques that you can implement when you do have the space to grow things in. So throughout the learning curve, you're always going to be growing. And maybe you get your foot in the door with houseplants and you just start building that connection there, understanding soil health, getting into the habit and the routine of learning about your plants, maintaining them well, maintaining their hygiene, what are things you can learn about pruning, and helping your plants to grow and thrive. So there's so many different ways that you can get started with gardening. You don't have to have a 1/4 acre or an acre or 2 acres. You don't have to have any property. Even if you just have your balcony or your patio, you can grow something. And if you aren't able to grow something in the soil yet, definitely work on watering yourself. Priority and insight number 2 is budget. This is, again, one of those things that can be really intimidating for the beginner gardener or somebody who's maybe going through a season where they want to do more gardening, but they just don't feel like they have the finances to throw at it. Please do not be discouraged. You can absolutely expand your gardening work or get it started for a very low cost. I have been hobby gardening for close to 10 years now, and really this started off as just buying starter plants, putting them in the ground, using various materials for raised beds, and just experimenting. Okay, so I've done a lot of experimenting on a budget over the years. The main things that I have spent money on year after year, season after season, is things like compost and soil conditioner to kind of amend the soil that I'm growing in. But this past year that I've been setting up our new garden space in our backyard, I have really stuck to this budget gardening intention of mine. I don't think you have to spend a lot of money. And I think when you're of the mindset that you either can't or that you won't spend a lot of money on getting your garden set up, you have to be very resourceful. And this can actually be way more beneficial than just going out and buying raised beds, for example. I have a video that shows where I am building some of the raised beds in my garden using leftover wood materials from the shipping trucks that was left at a local nursery. I've also used pallets in my garden space. And when it comes to using materials like this, you want to make sure that they're heat treated wood and not chemically treated wood. Most of the things that you'll pick up will be marked with HT for heat treated, or they'll have other markings on them that hint to you what kind of treatment they've received. And so you always want to use heat treated or like raw materials with your food growing plants, especially just so that they're safe to grow in and eat from. You can check out that video. I've also used the same kind of wood to build a workbench for my garden space. I want to encourage you that you can get started gardening, or you can expand your garden space using free or very low cost materials. Maybe you have some landscape edging bricks in your yard that are not serving much of a purpose. You can use those to shape various raised bed spaces, or just to like section off certain plants that you want, or to just beautify your space. You can also check Facebook Marketplace or places like OfferUp and see what kinds of free materials people are giving away. Sometimes people are getting rid of a handful of leftover pavers or bricks that they don't need, and you can create a walkway with them, or you can, again, section off certain plants for very little cost. Budget gardening is totally possible. Really, I think the main things that you need to get started gardening, if you're fresh and brand new to this, if you have some outdoor land space to work with, then you already have the ground, you have some soil. This might need a little bit of amending, using things like compost and maybe a soil conditioner to kind of build up the ground there and improve the soil condition. So those are a couple things that you might need, but also just a few basic hand tools. You might need a shovel, a rake, like a hand trowel, and maybe like a little hand rake, and maybe a weeding tool. And that's going to be pretty sufficient for getting seeds or starts into the ground and preparing the space that you are going to be growing. And besides that, you'll just need some sunlight and a close by water source, like the hose. Oh, and then there's the seeds. Seeds or starts, depending on which you buy, or if you're doing a combination of both, you can also keep this pretty low cost. If you're learning how to harvest seeds from the things that you're growing, you can also minimize the amount of money you are investing in those parts of your gardening in the seasons going forward. It can be really cost effective, and especially if you're strategic and you have a nice plan in place, you'll be well on your way to a budget-friendly garden. And this brings me to insight or priority number 3, and that is planning. So throughout the years of my hobby gardening, I surprisingly have been terrible at planning out my spaces and planning out what I'm growing. And this is just one of those experiential learning things that I have done, and it's been a little bit painful at times because I look back on a few of the projects I maybe worked on and thought, wow, I spent so much time and so much effort and maybe even some money on this little project. And had I thought it out a little bit more clearly and pulled back and looked at the big picture and been a little bit more strategic and just given some time to this planning process, I would have saved myself a lot of effort, time, and money. But even in situations like that, when I kind of like regret it a little bit or it stings a little bit, I'm always learning something. This might be learning more about the characteristics of my space, or it might be guiding me in the direction of what that finalized big vision like plan is going to be. We have a little sprout joining us for the rest of the video. So when it comes to planning, there are, there's about 4 things that I'll touch on that I think are really wise to consider and factor into your plans for your garden or your landscaping space. We'll start by talking about the space itself. What are the qualities and characteristics that you have to work with? All right. When I say we have rocky soil, I'm not kidding. But I like the rocks, how they look in the landscape, so we're gonna dig this bad boy up. Here we go, Jay. We dug around it. Now it's time to get her out. what are the light conditions or the moisture conditions, maybe even the wind conditions or the soil conditions in the space that you plan to be growing in. For me, I'm working on a backyard vision that I have. So every space in my backyard, I hope to be functional or productive or very useful and enjoyable for me and my family and our visitors and wildlife. So I'm kind of working on our whole backyard in different areas and different phases. And so I have to really consider which areas get full sun, which areas get afternoon sun because they're on the side of the house, or which areas are up against the fence and they're quite a bit more shaded. There's different conditions in the yard and in the entire space and in the garden. Just being really strategic about creating your plan based on the characteristics and the qualities that already exist in your space. That's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headache and probably a lot of work and even some money if you are just planning things out wisely based on what is happening in your space already. The next thing you'll want to factor into your plan is the phases that your landscape will go through, or the phases that your garden will go through. When it comes to planting things like natives and you're maybe working on like a native plant garden or a pollinator garden, you'll want to consider bloom times of flowers and plants that you can leave over winter so that birds have access to seeds. But also, if you're planting things like perennial shrubs or fruit trees, you'll want to keep in mind that these things will grow larger over time. So when you're initially planting them, you'll want to make sure that they have plenty of space to grow to their full size in years to come. But in the meantime, instead of having a bunch of dead space in between them, you might be really strategic about planting perennial flowers and annual flowers in ways that fill in the gaps, but they're not overtaking those shrubs that are trying to get established, or they're not blocking out the light for little trees that you want to grow and be really productive and fruitful. Considering the phases of your space will be really important. And this might also just be phases of certain projects. So for example, I'm working right now on a side yard project, and the pathway really needed to be fixed. I needed to fix the grading. So the first phase of that project was to just clear the space and grade it. And I was able to do that over one weekend by myself using a hoe, and I'm 20 weeks pregnant. So it was definitely some hard work, not too strenuous. I actually really enjoy that sculpting of the ground and, shifting the grading and all that and leveling things out. So I had lots of fun doing that. But because I was getting into that space and doing that work by hand myself, there was so much that I learned about the space. For me, that was phase 1 of the project. Then phase 2 is going to be finishing the path. And then phase 3 is going to be getting into the garden beds and figuring out exactly what I want to plant, planting those things. And phase 4 is like kind of let things grow, let the season pass, and see how that works, take mental notes, take actual notes. And that space is always going to be evolving. It'll always be going through different phases, especially depending on what I'm planting there. In successive years, those needs and the overall establishment of the space is going to change and evolve. The next thing I'll touch on when it comes to planning is your use for the space. Think about how you want to use your space. Think about how you already use your space and factor that into your design. When it comes to your garden, you'll want to plan out the things that you're planting. Where are you going to plant those annual vegetables? Where are you going to plant your perennial plants like blueberries? Planning to grow the things that you eat or the things that you might sell. Maybe you want a cut flower garden. Are you going to grow edible flowering plants in your garden space, or do you want a separate area for that? How are you going to be using that space? Is it easy for you to get in there with your hose and water things? Or are you going to set up things like irrigation to make that easier for you to use and manage and maintain the space? Keeping those things in mind as you work on your planning is going to save you a lot of time, and it's going to make gardening more enjoyable because you're actually getting to use up and eat and enjoy the things you've put time and effort into growing. And then the last point I'll touch on here for planning and for the rest of this video is native plants. And the reason I'm touching on native plants so much is because this is one thing I've really been getting into lately. I've been learning so much about native planting and planning out beautiful, lovely, productive, beneficial spaces that incorporate native plants primarily. And this is something that I'm going to be working toward getting established in our own landscape. And so This is beneficial not only for wildlife, but it's also beneficial for people. And it's beneficial for people because once native plants get established, usually like in their first growing season after planting them, they're pretty low maintenance. You can't really achieve a no maintenance landscape or garden entirely unless you are okay with everything just going wild and doing what it does. But if you'd like your time and money and design and planning investment to be beneficial long term, there's always going to be some degree of maintenance. But when it comes to the native plants, they usually need the most care in the first growing season, and then after that they can really start to take care of themselves because they're so adapted to your climate and the native soil conditions that that's where they can thrive without a lot of watering, without a lot of weeding once they get established, and they're suppressing the weeds that tend to pop up if you have a lot of bare ground, or if you have a lot of ornamentals, or if you're just not planning your space very well and putting down the proper mulching that is required. And the more that we can support wildlife and diversity of insects and support our native insects and wildlife like birds, for example, and squirrels, then the better off everyone is in the long run. I know that I really want my children to grow up seeing all kinds of caterpillars and dragonflies and butterflies and beetles and, all kinds of insects, so many different kinds of bees and little flies that will visit and pollinate your plants, not just your pretty native flowering things, but also in your vegetable garden. So the more that we can invite those little critters in, the better it's going to be for everyone in the short term and in the long run. So finding ways to incorporate natives into your landscape, learning the best way to do that so that it's appealing to the eye for neighbors who might be skeptical or critical of the way that you're approaching, gardening, especially if it's an area like a front yard. So you want to just start learning about these things. Keep in mind how resourceful you can be and maybe should be in your gardening approach. What's going to be the best way to invest in your gardening and in your landscaping, and plan out your space. This will just save you a lot of headache. If you'd like to see more gardening, lifestyle, and health videos, please head over to Curating Simple, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, and leave me some comments. I'd love to know what your questions are, share your experience with vegetable gardening and landscaping with native plants. Your knowledge can help the next person to grow. That is all for this video. You will see me in the next one. Until then, take care.